when it comes to receptor actions, there are different types of drug attachment, different types of ways the drug can work. And once again, we can still kind of use it as with a lock and key analogy. We talked about how when a drug attaches to a site and activates the receptor, how that allows the drug to have some action on the body. And when it does that, when it activates the receptor, or with the example of the car, uses a key to turn the car on, the drug is called an agonist. It has action. It is activating that receptor, and that's what's going to allow the action of the drug. An example of this would be a narcotic pain medication. Your body is full of opioid receptors, and when you take a narcotic pain medication for pain, it breaks down. It's processed by the liver. It's reduced to its smallest form, and all those molecules start traveling through the bloodstream. And when they run into a narcotic or opioid receptor, they can fit into that receptor and activate a response. And depending on what kind of receptor it is will determine the response that it comes up with. But of course, the response we want is pain relief. So a narcotic is sometimes referred to as an opioid agonist because it fits into the opioid receptor and turns it on. And that's where you get pain relief. You also get a feeling of happiness, you get relaxation, you get sedation, but you also might get itching, nausea, the kind of spacey feeling. So I'm trying to think of all the different side effects. Oh, pupil constriction and constipation. So a receptor, in some cases, isn't always going to give a therapeutic response. You'll get a therapeutic response plus other effects, which we will talk about later. Now, often drugs work as an antagonist, and the term antagonist or antagonism refers to something that's fighting against something. You know that if you have an antagonist in your life, they are bugging you, they are bothering you, they are interfering with what you're doing. So in this case, the drug attaches at the receptor site, but you don't have a response. It stops the receptor from activating. Sort of like when you put your key into your car lock, you can turn the car off. Or when you turn the key in the door of your house or apartment, you can lock it and allow yourself to do things in the house, but you also can, or you can unlock it, but you can also lock it. You can use it to turn it off and prevent anyone else from getting in there. So an example of a drug that works as a receptor antagonist is Narcan. Narcan is an opioid antagonist. We know that we've heard all about Narcan in the fight against opioid addiction and overdose. And what it does is Narcan has a greater affinity for that opioid receptor than the opioid itself does. And so it'll temporarily kick off the opioid molecule and occupy the receptor and stop the actions of the opioid. And that is what has saved countless lives, is the ability to do that. Now, Narcan is attracted to opioid receptors, but it doesn't last as long as an opioid. So eventually it's going to wear off. Sort of like, somebody like comes and steals your seat and kicks you out of it, but then after a while they lose focus and they have a short attention span and they wander off and you can sit back down in it. That's kind of like the opioid molecules and the Narcan molecules. And we'll talk all about what you have to do as a nurse when you give somebody Narcan someday. Another medication might act as an agonist or an antagonist. It activates some receptors and it turns off other receptors. Sometimes pain meds act like this on an opioid receptor. They will activate one so you get that pain relief, but then they will turn off another one so you don't get as many of the side effects. So there's a pain med called Stadol that it's an agonist-antagonist. It's only partially opioid. And so the result is you get pain relief, but it's got different effects than an opioid, and you generally do not see the addiction potential with a drug that's an agonist-antagonist. Then you get something that's called a partial agonist. This drug attaches at the receptor site, but you only get a small chemical response, not the full one. And so an example of that would be a nicotine patch. We have receptors that respond to nicotine. That's why you get the results you do from smoking and why it becomes very addictive. We have nicotine receptors. And so if you smoke, you get kind of the full results of that nicotine, both positive, how it makes people feel, and negative, the poisons and the long-term effects it has. If someone wants to quit smoking, it's very difficult. It's harder to smoke than it is to stop pretty much anything else, from what I've heard, because nicotine has such a powerful effect on the receptors. So what you can do is you can get a nicotine patch that gives a small amount of nicotine. Not enough to give you the full result, but enough hopefully to stop or slow down those nicotine cravings and make it a little bit easier not to have an actual cigarette. Some agonists or antagonists can compete with the other chemicals at the receptor site to make it more difficult for one or the other. Some may actually replace them, like we see with Narcan and opioid. And we'll talk a little bit more about those reactions and what drugs do when they work together later on in this chapter. Now, there are 4 basic drug processes that are in play whenever we take any kind of medication or any kind of drug. And those processes are absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. We already talked about how drugs are introduced into the body in chapter 4. We talked about the enteral route. We talked about parenteral, which can include epidural injection of medicine into the cerebrospinal fluid. And we talked about percutaneous, which is topical, sublingual, buccal, inhaled, and transdermal. So this is one way that all drugs can get into the body eventually. Topical actually is a little bit misleading because topical is supposed to just work on the top of the skin. It's transdermal that gets in and works in the bloodstream. Remember that I said that's the key. Is this going to get into the bloodstream or not? All drugs have solubility. And solubility, if you look in the terms on page 23, solubility is the ability of a drug to dissolve in various body fluids. So we have, for instance, in Ms. Hill's nutrition class, you learned about fat-soluble vitamins and water-soluble vitamins. Medications that are fat-soluble dissolve more readily in the presence of adipose tissue, whereas water-soluble drugs are more easily dissolvable in body fluids such as water, blood, lymph. You can see in your book, we see the speed of absorption, fastest being IV. It's immediately available in the vein, and inhalation works pretty quickly too, all the way down to the slowest, which are timed release capsules. They're made to break down over several hours. And on page 26, we sort of get the order of the process. We're going to come back and look at the top of page 25, diffusion, osmosis, and filtration. But let's go to page 26, and we see that absorption takes place first. Then one way or the other, the medication has to be absorbed somehow into the blood and the tissues, and this is when it works by diffusion, filtration, and osmosis. Then the drug is distributed. How does it travel through the body? Usually carried through blood or lymph fluid. And then it gets to the site of action. But first, if it's taken enterally, it has to be broken down, metabolized, broken down into a form the body can use. You can't just swallow a pill and have it immediately get to the bloodstream. It has to dissolve in the stomach. It has to absorb into the walls of the stomach, into the bloodstream, or down into the small intestine, and then into the bloodstream. And if anything goes through the GI tract, it's going to pass through the liver. Everything taken by mouth passes through the liver, and the liver breaks it down. It looks and says, what the heck is this? Well, I need to work on this a little. And it breaks it down into a form the body can recognize. And then finally, we see excretion. The drug has to be removed from the body somehow. And it's mostly done through kidneys when we urinate, which is why drug tests are pretty accurate. Even though our patients many times will swear they're not. The GI tract, sometimes it leaves in the stool a certain amount. We also breathe out, and some molecules of substances we have taken in are excreted in our breath. That's where like garlic breath comes from. And then sometimes there are tiny amounts in our perspiration as well.